Thinking about his artwork appears on your new book, Cerridwen.
Yes.
She's on the front cover. His artwork's on the front cover.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, I'm assuming she's someone that's very important to you.
Yeah. Yeah. She was one of the first goddesses I ever worked with. Teen me was invoking Ceridwen and Danu. But it's my understanding of her has changed over the years and evolved. She's a real classic example of the more you can learn about a deity, the more you can learn about a tradition, the deeper it can get and the different avenues it takes you on. Because I originally understood her as a kind of goddess of the witches, really, the kind of the cauldron and the kind of the potions and that kind of side of things. And I understood her as a kind of crone, really, as well. I don't really do the maiden mother crone thing anymore, but back in the day, I understood her as, that's how I would perceive her. She's described as a witch. But now, this has been a real labour of love writing this Ceridwen book, and I've put in a lot of my academic research and applied it so that it's of use to people, really. It's, that's a really strong angle for me, is using the kind of the academic side of things and finding access to stuff that people won't necessarily be able to access, or translations and insights and, what we really know, what we really, really know about somebody like a figure like Ceridwen. We know there's not tons, but we do know a certain chunk of definites. And I wanted to make that really available because a lot can get lost, especially these days in the kind of modern era and the internet. Names get attached to things and
on the internet. Yeah,
context with its roots. Well, I felt it was really, really important to honour Ceridwen's roots, so I kind of really put time in. I was really lucky, really blessed to have some real good support from my university, not in any kind of official capacity or anything like that, but just a welcoming attitude coming to them as a pagan practitioner, and kind of having conversations and discussing kind of translations and things like this, and just kind of, it's very much my own work, but nonetheless using some of that stuff as a sounding board, using the kind of academic knowledge about her as a sounding board, to say, to present what you can say for sure. So hopefully in this book, I've come across with what you can definitely know about her, and then I've made it clear which bits are how I've interpreted that and how I work with that. Because I see her much more as an initiator now. I was aware of Taliesin and the story of Taliesin and Ceridwen even as a teen, but it has greater depth for me now, and I see greater context at play. I think she's asked her story with the cauldron and with Taliesin and the Arwen and the kind of transformations that she goes through, the famous stories, are the very end. Well, not the end, because I don't think it's the end for her at all, but the kind of the written down version of something that's a very ancient story that goes back a really, really long way. And again, I don't like to use the term shamanism so much now, but an animistic, ecstatic, perhaps shamanic, I don't know whether she would have been a cult or whether she would have just been a kind of a spirit vision seeking tradition, I think is there, that probably goes back, right into deep history.
That makes sense, because she changes into all the animals, doesn't she?
Yeah, exactly.
In the story.
Exactly. She goes through earth and sky.
Definitely.
So many aspects of the story are teaching ingredients, really. And I think when you go right back to the kind of the earliest understandings of a lot of this stuff, because there's a lot of things in there that are about war and life and death and journeys after death. And I really feel like you can trace the threads of her story back to something very ancient, very, very ancient. There's lots of stories in the Brythonic tradition and in the Irish they feel like the oldest ones, but it's difficult to prove by that point because they go so far back that it's difficult to say. But the sense that the stories are about, for instance, the not Ceridwen's cauldron, but Bran's cauldron, comes from a giantess who basically births all these warriors yeah, and the cauldron can be used. The same in this story is similar in Ireland, where warriors come back to life out of the cauldron, but they cannot say what they've seen. Yeah, and there's a couple of different instances across Wales and Ireland of this. Obviously, having some kind of visionary, initiatory experience that you do not share what you experience, but you come back changed. And it's always in this kind of warrior thing, rather than a kind of poet thing or a kind of druidy, witchy thing. It seems to be really about losing your fear of death. So it seems to go back really far, kind of warrior initiation kind of stuff. But all we have is threads. All we have is little hints and little clues. So I find that really interesting, because I think with Ceridwen, we've got a goddess who is very present now, very clear now what she wants and who she communicates with and how to work with her. She's got a very strong modern presence, and I think that's wonderful and amazing. But it's interesting because she must, logically, from an academic perspective, she's probably the most recent face of a being that goes right back to much heavier stuff, and much more about our journey after death, and perhaps where we come from before we're born, and that kind of initiatory, kind of outside of time and space, kind of quite heavy stuff. And yet now we see her as this kind of witchy goddess, and it's good that she's still got this kind of dark goddess kind of reputation. But of course, in the story, she's actually a mother. She's not an old woman. She's of childbearing years. So we have to sort of throw out a lot of kind of 20th century kind of slightly, wonky ideas, and realise that what we have now is her most recent face. But what she's offering us potentially is something very deep indeed. So, she's very much still the goddess of potions and brews, if that's how you want to work with her. I think I certainly wouldn't suggest that I speak for her and how she's going to approach anybody else. But she's definitely an initiator. She's definitely somebody who helps you go into much deeper states of connection with the land and the ancestors and stuff like that as well. I like to think that perhaps, and this is purely my fantasy, but I like to think that perhaps, a couple of thousand years ago, there was a cult of people up in the mountains in Wales somewhere taking mushrooms and seeing the spirits and coming up with oracular poetry and honouring her as their goddess or their high priestess or something like that.
That's good as an explanation as any.
Well, I think there's hints that something like that might have been the case. But again, all you can say with this stuff is hints. But I kind of feel like there's what level do you want to take it at with Ceridwen? Do you want to have her assist you with the Arwen for, writing lovely poems for your sort of druid celebrations, or helping you create kind of kitchen witchery kind of things? Or do you want to have her help you be really good at talking to the dead? And they're different layers. They're the same goddess. I love her dearly. And she sat on my shoulder, really making sure that I did my very best work. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's really, really important to go back to the oldest sources. I think for whatever you're researching or writing about or even learning about, I think particularly with something like deity, going back to the oldest sources will teach so much. Yeah. Because as you say, there's so much rubbish on the internet. I'm sorry, internet, I love you, but there's an awful lot of rubbish out there.
We can lose so much knowledge if we just forget about the roots of things, we forget about doing the homework for something. Doesn't mean to say that you can't build on that. And I think what I've tried to do in my Ceridwen book is say, here is the history, here's the context, here's the sources, here's the translations, here's the kind of meat of what we're talking about. But, here is also, here's an incense mix that I've made because I felt that this was the right thing to do at the time. For my work with her now, here's a way of working with her that has worked for me here and now. And have it have what you do, have those roots and grow from it rather than ignore the roots or not even be aware that the roots are there. I think that's so important, and it's so important as well to situate her in Welsh culture and in Welsh history. That's also really, really vitally important. It's the roots of her. And it doesn't mean to say that the door is shut to anybody else, but it does say let's honour the context in which we find her and the rich culture that has kept her going, kept her name on people's tongues, and then grow from that. And no doubt people will be working with her for centuries to come in new and wonderful, magical ways, but so much is lost if we forget the roots,
Yeah.
And I'm a real,
respect.
I'm a Taurus. I like the earth stuff. I like the history. That's really important to me. I kind of keep up slowly rather than speed ahead. So I like to know that I'm on steady ground with something.
Yeah. It's respect for her, respect for her legend, her story. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. It's vital. If there's knowledge to be had, I feel it's our duty to try and get it, to try and know it, to try and understand it, to try and acknowledge the roots of something, the culture that something comes from. It's our responsibility to do that and to hold it really well, to pass on to future generations where possible, If we're going to use it, then we have to honour it, I think. Yeah, for sure. But it's a difficult one because so much of these materials are fragments and, lost. We've lost more than we've retained, with the Welsh lore and the Irish, the Scottish. We've got tantalising fragments, but there has to be quite a lot of smart guesswork as well.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with saying
history.
Yeah.
That's history altogether, isn't it?
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with saying we've got this and it might mean that.
Yeah.
But sometimes you go, it might mean rather than it definitely is, or completely fabricate something. I think you can make logical steps from what we have. And I think that's really important. Yeah. And with her, I felt like that was really vital. She's so popular today, and yet so few people really understand the context of the kind of the Welsh bardic tradition that she's been preserved in so well and so beautifully, because so much of that bardic tradition has its roots in something really visionary and oracular and ancient, and yet it's still got such a strong Welsh identity aspect to it as well. That, it's really important that we honour that. If we're going to work with her, it's really, really important that we honour that, I think. And quite frankly, she demands it. I've worked with her for a long time, and she doesn't take any rubbish. She doesn't take any ifs or buts or cutting corners. Not with me, anyway.
That's actually the bottom line, is you've got to do it because Ceridwen says you have to.
Yeah.
So
that's the
can't
thing,
argue with that.
Really? I try really hard to connect with my gods and to connect with the spirits. Yeah. And I do believe that it's down to me, but it's usually a good idea to listen to what they're suggesting and to honour them and behave honourably in how you work with this stuff, So,
that's experience speaking.
Well, yeah. Hard-won experience, for sure.
And lessons learned.
Yeah. Those of us that were teen witches back in the day, we learned the hard way.